This woman scoffed at an elderly veteran in the parade. She had no idea the shocking truth she'd learn about him. November wind whipped through downtown Chicago's streets, carrying with it the sound of distant drums and the occasional burst of brass instruments. Sandra pulled her wool coat tighter around her shoulders, checking her phone for what felt like the 100th time in the past 15 minutes. She hadn't wanted to be here in the first place, and the weather wasn't doing anything to improve her mood. "You're going to love it," her friend Rachel had insisted earlier that morning, practically dragging her out of their favorite coffee shop. It's the biggest Veterans Day parade in Midwest. The excitement in Rachel's voice had been hard to resist, but now, standing among the growing crowd of spectators, Sandra wished she'd been more stubborn in her refusal. The parade route stretched down Michigan Avenue, with people already lined up 3 deep along the metal barriers. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, small American flags clutched in their mittened hands. The whole scene felt like something out of a holiday movie, but Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow separate from it all, an unwilling participant in someone else's celebration. She glanced at her watch again, calculating how long she needed to stay before making a polite excuse to leave. The morning's work emails were piling up. She could feel her phone vibrating in her pocket with each new notification. As a junior partner at her law firm, Sandra knew that every minute spent away from her desk was a minute she'd have to make up later. "They're coming," someone in the crowd shouted, and a ripple of excitement passed through the spectators. Sandra looked up briefly, then back down at her phone, her thumb scrolling through urgent messages from clients and colleagues. The parade had started moving, but all she could think about was the deadline looming over her latest case. The first marching band passed by, their uniforms crisp and bright in the morning sun. Behind them came a group of Boy Scouts carrying a massive American flag, followed by local politicians waving from convertibles. Sandra barely registered any of it, too busy responding to an email about a postponed deposition. Rachel nudged her with an elbow. "Hey, put that away for a bit," she whispered, nodding towards Sandra's phone. "You're missing everything." "I'm watching," Sandra muttered, though they both knew she wasn't. She finished typing her email and hit send, only to have another notification pop up immediately. The crowd around them began to stir with increased energy, and the sound of applause pulled her attention away from the screen momentarily. A group of elderly veterans was approaching, moving in loose formation down the parade route. Their uniforms, though decades old, had been meticulously maintained, medals and ribbons gleaming on their chests. Some walked with canes, others supported by younger family members, but all held their heads high as they passed. The crowd's reaction was immediate and powerful. People began cheering, many standing on tiptoes to get a better view. Sandra, however, felt her impatience growing. The veterans moved at what seemed to her an agonizingly slow pace, each step measured and deliberate. She shifted her weight from foot to foot, checking the time again. "This is ridiculous," she mumbled under her breath, just loud enough for Rachel to hear. "At this rate, we'll be here all day." Rachel shot her a disapproving look, but Sandra pretended not to notice. She was too busy thinking about the mountain of work waiting for her at the office, the meetings she'd have to reschedule, and the briefs she needed to review before Monday. The parade, with its slow-moving participants and endless procession, felt like nothing more than an inconvenient interruption to her carefully planned schedule. The applause around her swelled as the veterans drew closer. Sandra watched as people wiped tears from their eyes, their faces full of emotion she couldn't quite understand. Even Rachel, usually as practical and business-minded as Sandra herself, seemed moved by the display. Sandra rolled her eyes, scrolling through her social media feed to pass the time. A young girl near Sandra held up a hand-drawn sign that read, "Thank you for our freedom," in wobbly crayon letters. Her father lifted her onto his shoulders, and she waved the sign enthusiastically as the veterans passed. Sandra glanced up just long enough to see one of the elderly men break into a wide smile, waving back at the child with surprising energy. The crowd's reaction puzzled her. Sure, these were veterans, and yes, they deserved respect. She understood that much. But the level of emotion seemed excessive to her. People were acting as if these slow-moving elderly men were something extraordinary, when to Sandra they appeared to be simply holding up the parade. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her boss. "Need the Johnson brief by end of day," it read. Sandra felt her stomach tighten. She'd completely forgotten about the Johnson brief, and now she was stuck here, watching what felt like the slowest parade in history. "Maybe we should go," she suggested to Rachel, trying to keep her voice neutral. "I've got a lot of work to catch up on." Rachel shook her head firmly. "We've only been here 20 minutes, Sandra. Your work will still be there when we're done." She pointed toward the veterans. "This is important. These men sacrificed so much for us." Sandra bit back her retort. She'd heard this kind of talk before, about sacrifice and duty and honor. It all seemed very abstract to her, very distant from her daily reality of billable hours and client meetings. These men had served decades ago, in wars that felt like ancient history to her. What did that have to do with her life now? The crowd continued to applaud as more veterans passed by. Sandra noticed that some of them wore caps indicating they'd served in Vietnam, others in Korea. A few even wore World War II veteran badges. Their ages varied, but they all shared the same dignified bearing, the same proud set to their shoulders despite their slow pace. Sandra's friends had positioned themselves right at the front of the crowd, which meant she had a clear view of everything, whether she wanted it or not. She watched as one veteran paused to shake hands with a young serviceman in the crowd, the two men exchanging words she couldn't hear. The moment seemed to stretch on forever, and Sandra felt her frustration building. Time seemed to move as slowly as the parade itself. Sandra checked her email again, responded to a few messages, and even managed to schedule a lunch meeting for next week. All around her, people continued to watch the parade with rapt attention, but she remained determinedly disconnected from the enthusiasm. The morning sun had risen higher, warming the air slightly, but Sandra barely noticed. She was too busy mentally calculating how much time she'd need to make up at the office. The parade continued its slow progress down Michigan Avenue, each new group of veterans moving just as unhurriedly as the last. "Look," Rachel whispered, pointing to a particularly elderly veteran who was now approaching their section of the crowd. "That's George Thompson. I read about him in the Tribune last week." Sandra glanced up briefly, seeing nothing more remarkable than another older man in a uniform walking slowly down the street. She nodded absently, already looking back at her phone, unaware that her next actions would lead to a moment that would change her perspective forever. The parade had been going on for nearly 45 minutes now, and Sandra's patience was wearing dangerously thin. Her phone battery had dipped below 20%, adding to her growing anxiety about the day's wasted time. The veteran Rachel had pointed out, George, apparently, was still making his way down the route, pausing every few steps to acknowledge the crowd's endless waves and cheers. Sandra watched him with mounting irritation. He moved with careful, measured steps, his metals catching the late morning sun. Every few yards, he'd stop completely, turning to wave at a child or shake someone's extended hand. Each pause felt like an eternity to Sandra, who'd long since given up any pretense of enjoying the parade. "This is getting ridiculous," she muttered, loud enough for several people nearby to turn and look. Rachel grabbed her arm, squeezing it in warning, but Sandra shrugged her off. The morning's frustrations, the urgent emails, the forgotten brief, the endless parade, had built up like pressure in a kettle, and she was ready to blow. George had stopped again, this time to salute a young serviceman in dress blues who stood at attention in the crowd. The veteran's movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as he raised his weathered hand to his forehead. The crowd around them fell silent, watching the moment unfold with reverent attention. Sandra checked her watch again, calculating the hours she'd need to work over the weekend to make up for this morning. Her law firm didn't accept excuses, even ones involving Veterans Day parades. Junior partners were expected to be available, responsive, and, above all, productive. Standing here watching elderly men walk down Michigan Avenue felt like the opposite of productive. The sun had climbed higher, and despite the November chill, Sandra felt uncomfortably warm in her wool coat. She shifted her weight again, trying to find a comfortable position against the metal barrier. Around her, people continued to watch the parade with unwavering interest, their faces showing nothing but patience and respect. "How much longer is this going to take?" Sandra whispered to Rachel, though she knew her friend wouldn't have an answer. Rachel just shook her head, her attention focused on George, who had now stopped to speak with a group of children waving small American flags. Sandra watched as he bent down slowly, painfully slowly in her opinion, to talk to them at eye level. The children's parents beamed, quickly pulling out phones to capture the moment. More delays, more waiting, more time slipping away from her already overcrowded schedule. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from her boss. "Where's the Johnson brief?" Sandra felt her stomach clench. She'd promised to have it on his desk first thing Monday morning, but at this rate, she'd need to spend her entire Sunday at the office to finish it. The crowd's constant applause was starting to give her a headache. Every few minutes, another wave of cheering would sweep through the spectators, accompanied by shouts of "Thank you for your service" and "God bless our veterans." The enthusiasm felt forced to Sandra, as if everyone was playing a part in some patriotic performance she hadn't signed up for. George was now barely 10 yards from where Sandra stood, still moving at his maddeningly slow pace. She could see him more clearly now, the slight tremor in his hands, the careful way he placed each foot, the deep lines etched into his face. To everyone else, these signs of age seemed to command respect. To Sandra, they were just more reasons this parade was taking forever. The pressure of the morning finally reached its breaking point. As George paused yet again, this time to wave at a group of Boy Scouts, something inside Sandra snapped. The words burst out of her before she could stop them, loud and sharp in the respectful quiet of the crowd. "Come on, speed it up. Some of us have places to be." Her voice carried clearly over the crowd, cutting through the ambient noise of the parade like a knife. The effect was immediate and devastating. The people around her fell silent, their expressions shifting from surprise to disbelief to anger in rapid succession. Rachel stepped away from her, face burning with secondhand embarrassment. George himself didn't seem to hear the outburst, but several other veterans in the parade turned to look in Sandra's direction. Their faces remained composed, dignified, but their eyes held a mixture of hurt and disappointment that made Sandra's cheeks burn. A woman standing nearby covered her young son's ears, shooting Sandra a look of pure disgust. An elderly man in a Vietnam veteran cap shook his head slowly, his expression making Sandra feel about 2 inches tall. The bubble of uncomfortable silence spread outward from where she stood, creating a pocket of tension in the otherwise celebratory atmosphere. Sandra's first instinct was to defend herself. After all, she had responsibilities, deadlines, important work waiting for her. Didn't these people understand that not everyone could spend their whole morning watching old men walk down the street? But the words died in her throat as she saw the faces around her. A teenage girl near Sandra had tears in her eyes. Whether from anger or sadness was hard to tell. Her father, wearing a Marine Corps t-shirt, wrapped an arm around her shoulders, whispering something in her ear while staring daggers at Sandra. The girl nodded, wiping her eyes, but the hurt expression remained. The parade continued moving, but the damage was done. The festive atmosphere around Sandra had evaporated, replaced by a heavy, awkward tension. People who had been standing shoulder to shoulder with her moments ago now created subtle distance, shifting away as if her impatience might be contagious. Rachel still hadn't looked at her since the outburst. Sandra could see her friend's shoulders were tight with anger, her hands clenched at her sides. The silence between them felt thick and uncomfortable, filled with all the things Rachel was clearly stopping herself from saying. Sandra's phone buzzed again in her pocket, but for the first time that morning, she didn't reach for it. The urgency of her work emails suddenly felt less important in the face of the social catastrophe she'd just created. She could feel eyes on her from all directions, judging, condemning. The parade marshal, a tall man in a crisp uniform, had noticed the disturbance. He glanced in Sandra's direction, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp with disapproval. Sandra wanted to disappear into the ground. She hadn't meant to cause a scene. She'd just been frustrated, tired, stressed about work. George continued his slow progress down the parade route, still unaware of the drama he'd inadvertently sparked. Sandra watched him now with different eyes, not out of respect or understanding, but from a growing sense of mortification. She'd just publicly disrespected a veteran on Veterans Day in front of a crowd of hundreds. The murmurs around her grew louder, and Sandra could catch snippets of conversation. Can you believe someone would? No respect these days. Who raised her to? Each whispered comment felt like another small wound to her pride, but she knew she had no one to blame but herself. The silence that followed Sandra's outburst didn't last long. Like a wave building strength before it crashes, the murmurs around her grew steadily louder. She could feel the disapproval radiating from the crowd, could see it in the way people glanced at her and then quickly looked away, shaking their heads. A middle-aged man standing next to her shifted his weight, turning to face her directly. His face was flushed with emotion, and Sandra noticed he wore a navy blue cap with USS Enterprise embroidered in gold thread. He cleared his throat, and Sandra braced herself for the criticism she knew was coming. "Do you know who that is?" he asked, his voice tight with barely contained anger. His question hung in the air between them, demanding an answer. Sandra shrugged, trying to maintain some semblance of composure despite her growing discomfort. "Just some slow old man holding everyone up," she said, the words coming out more defensive than she'd intended. Even as she spoke, she knew she was making things worse, but something in her refused to back down. The man's face darkened, and Sandra saw his hands clench into fists before deliberately relaxing. Behind him, a small group of onlookers had turned to watch their exchange, adding to Sandra's discomfort. Rachel had stepped even further away, her body language making it clear she wanted no part of what was about to unfold. "That slow old man," the sailor said, emphasizing each word, "is George Thompson. And if you'd put your phone down for 5 minutes, you might know what that means." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But I guess I shouldn't expect someone like you to understand sacrifice." Sandra felt her face grow hot. "Someone like me?" she repeated, knowing she should stop talking but unable to help herself. "What's that supposed to mean?" A woman nearby, probably in her 60s, joined the conversation. "It means someone who thinks their time is more valuable than showing respect to heroes," she said quietly. Her words carried no anger, just a deep disappointment that somehow felt worse. The sailor nodded at the woman in acknowledgement before turning back to Sandra. "That man you just yelled at? He's not just another veteran in the parade. He's a living legend in this city." His voice had taken on a teacher's tone, as if he decided Sandra needed an education rather than a scolding. Around them, the parade continued. Other veterans marched past, but the crowd in Sandra's immediate vicinity seemed more interested in the confrontation unfolding on the sidewalk. Sandra noticed a few people had pulled out their phones, and she prayed they weren't recording. "I don't see what the big deal is," Sandra muttered, though her voice had lost some of its earlier defiance. "It's just a parade. People are acting like it's some kind of sacred ceremony." The sailor's expression shifted from anger to something closer to pity. "To many of us, it is sacred," he said, "especially when it comes to men like George. Do you have any idea what he did during the war? Do you know anything about the lives he saved?" Sandra remained silent, her earlier bravado fading under the weight of the man's questions. She didn't know anything about George, she realized. She hadn't bothered to learn, hadn't cared enough to ask, hadn't even considered that there might be more to the story than what she could see from her narrow perspective. The crowd around them had grown quieter, people leaning in slightly to hear the sailor's words. Even Rachel had turned back, her anger apparently tempered by curiosity about what the man might say next. "Back in '68, the sailor continued, his voice taking on a storyteller's cadence, "George was just a young lieutenant. Not much older than you are now. His unit was pinned down in one of the worst firefights you can imagine." He paused, making sure Sandra was listening. Most people would have looked for a way out. George? He looked for a way in. Sandra found herself drawn into the story, despite her earlier dismissiveness. The sailor's words painted a picture far removed from the elderly man she'd seen shuffling down Michigan Avenue. The enemy had another American unit surrounded, he went on. No air support could get through. Command had written them off as lost. But George refused to accept that. He gathered a group of volunteers and went in after them. More people had joined their impromptu audience. Sandra noticed that many of them were nodding along, familiar with the story, but eager to hear it again. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but for once, she didn't reach for it. They moved through territory that was supposed to be impossible to cross. George led them through jungle so thick you couldn't see 3 feet ahead. They crawled through mud under enemy fire for hours. Half his men were wounded before they even reached the trap. Ped unit. The sailor's voice grew quieter, forcing people to lean in closer. But George wouldn't stop. He kept going, kept pushing forward. When they finally reached the surrounded unit, they found over 20 men, most of them wounded, all of them out of ammunition and hope. Sandra felt a flicker of something, shame, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. She thought about the elderly man she'd just yelled at, trying to reconcile him with the young lieutenant in the story. Getting in was hard, the sailor continued, but getting out was nearly impossible. George made trip after trip, carrying wounded men to safety. He was shot twice, but kept going. When they ran out of stretchers, he carried men on his back. When he was too exhausted to carry them, he crawled, dragging them behind him. The woman who had spoken earlier wiped tears from her eyes. Others in the crowd wore similar expressions of emotion. Sandra stood still, her earlier impatience forgotten as she listened. By the time it was over, George had saved 23 men. 23 sons who got to go home to their mothers. 23 husbands who got to see their wives again. 23 fathers who got to watch their children grow up. The sailor's voice cracked slightly. My father was one of them. Sandra felt her mouth go dry. The sailor's personal connection to the story hit her like a physical blow. She thought about her own father, safe at home in Minnesota, probably watching football on his Sunday afternoon off. So yes, the sailor concluded, George moves slowly these days. Those wounds he took while saving my father never really healed right. But he's earned the right to take all the time he needs. And the very least, we can do is stand here and show him the respect he deserves. The silence that followed was profound. Sandra could hear the parade continuing behind them, but it seemed distant now, less important than the story she'd just heard. She looked down at her feet, unable to meet the eyes of the people around her. Her phone buzzed again in her pocket. This time, she reached in and turned it off completely. The sailor wasn't finished. Now that he had Sandra's full attention, he seemed determined to make her understand the full weight of her mistake. He pulled out his wallet and carefully extracted an old, creased photograph, handling it with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. This was taken the day after the rescue, he said, holding it out for Sandra to see. The black and white image showed a group of muddy, exhausted soldiers. In the center stood a young man, his uniform torn and blood-stained, supporting another soldier who could barely stand. Despite the grime and obvious exhaustion, the young man's eyes held a fierce determination that Sandra found familiar. That's George, she asked quietly, noting how different he looked from the elderly veteran she'd just berated. The young man in the photo couldn't have been more than 25, but his expression carried the weight of someone much older. That's him, the sailor confirmed. And that man he's holding up? That's my father. He touched the photo gently before returning it to his wallet. Dad never talked much about that day. Said some memories were too heavy to put into words. But he made sure we knew about George. Made sure we understood what real courage looks like. More people had gathered around them, forming a small semicircle of listeners. Sandra noticed that many of them were nodding, some wiping away tears. A teenage boy near the front was recording everything on his phone, but for once, Sandra didn't mind being filmed. The rescue mission wasn't even the whole story, an elderly woman in the crowd added. She stepped forward, introducing herself as a retired nurse who had worked at the VA hospital where George had spent months recovering. I remember when they brought him in. The doctors couldn't believe he was still alive, let alone conscious. The nurse's voice took on a professional tone as she continued. 3 bullet wounds, shrapnel in his back and legs, severe dehydration and exhaustion. Any one of those injuries could have killed him. But George just kept asking about the men he'd rescued, wanting to make sure they all made it. Sandra listened, her earlier impatience forgotten. Each new detail added depth to the man she'd so carelessly dismissed. The nurse described George's lengthy recovery, how he'd pushed himself through months of painful rehabilitation, refusing to give up even when the doctors suggested he might never walk normally again. He used to tell us that pain was just weakness leaving the body, the nurse recalled, smiling at the memory. But we knew better. We could see how much it hurt him. Yet every day, he'd be there in the therapy room, working harder than anyone else. And you know what amazed me the most? He never complained. Not once. The sailor nodded in agreement. That's George for you. Never wanted attention, never asked for recognition. When they gave him the medal, he tried to refuse it, said he was just doing what anyone would have done. What medal? Sandra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She had a feeling she already knew the answer, but she needed to hear it. The Medal of Honor, the sailor replied solemnly. The highest award this country can give. But if you ask George about it, he'll tell you the real honor was serving with the men who didn't come home. A young soldier in dress uniform, who had been listening quietly until now, stepped forward. I met George at a veterans event last year, he said. Spent hours talking with him. You know what he wanted to discuss? Not his medals, not his heroics. He wanted to know about the younger generation of soldiers, how we were doing, if we were getting the support we needed. The young soldier's words painted yet another dimension of George's character. He gave me his phone number, the soldier continued. Told me to call if I ever needed someone to talk to. Said sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight after coming home. Sandra felt a lump forming in her throat. She thought about her own problems, the deadlines, the emails, the office politics, and how insignificant they seemed compared to what George had faced. Her embarrassment was shifting into something deeper, a genuine shame at her behavior. The nurse spoke up again, her voice gentle but firm. That limp you were so impatient about? That's from the shrapnel they could never fully remove. Every step he takes causes him pain. But he still walks in every parade, still stands for hours at veterans events, still visits schools to talk to children about service and sacrifice. Last month, another voice added, this time from a middle-aged woman in a teacher's uniform. He spent an entire day at our elementary school, sat with every class, answered every question, no matter how simple or repetitive. When one little girl asked if his injuries hurt, he just smiled and said, not as much as missing this chance to meet you would. The stories kept coming, each one revealing another facet of the man Sandra had so thoughtlessly dismissed. People in the crowd shared their own encounters with George, how he'd helped establish a support group for veterans struggling with PTSD, how he'd fought to improve VA services, how he'd spent his own money to help veterans' families in need. 2 years ago, the sailor added, my father was dying in the hospital. George visited him every day for 3 weeks straight, sat there telling stories, sharing memories, making Dad laugh even when the pain was worst. The day before Dad passed, George brought him his old unit flag. You should have seen Dad's face light up. Sandra looked down the parade route, where George was still making his way forward, unaware of the conversation happening in his wake. She saw now what she'd missed before, the dignity in his measured steps, the strength it took to keep going despite the pain, the humble grace with which he accepted the crowd's admiration. I remember when they did the groundbreaking for the new Veterans Memorial. Someone else chimed in. George insisted on using the same shovel he'd carried in Vietnam. Said it felt right, using a tool that had once been used in war to now break ground for peace. The young soldier nodded. He told me once that the greatest honor of his life wasn't receiving the Medal of Honor. It was getting to see the children and grandchildren of the men he saved, getting to watch the lives that might never have been, if not for that night in the jungle. Sandra felt tears pricking at her eyes. She thought about her own words. Speed it up, she'd yelled. Some of us have places to be, and felt physically sick at her callousness. This man had given everything, had endured pain and sacrifice she could barely imagine, and she'd treated him like an inconvenience. The crowd around her had grown quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't the angry, judgmental silence from before. Instead, it was contemplative, heavy with shared respect for a man who had given so much and asked for so little in return. The military band's music swelled as George approached the main reviewing stand, their somber melody filling the air with dignity and reverence. Sandra, still reeling from the stories she'd heard, watched with new eyes as the elderly veteran made his way forward. Each step now held meaning she hadn't seen before. Each pause, each careful movement told a story of sacrifice and survival. The crowd around her had shifted its attention back to the parade, but the atmosphere felt different now. People weren't just watching, they were witnessing something profound. Children who had been fidgeting earlier stood still, American flags clutched quietly in their hands. Parents lifted their youngest ones onto shoulders, whispering explanations about the man they were watching. "Look," the sailor who had shared George's story said softly, pointing to something Sandra hadn't noticed before. Along the parade route, other veterans were turning to face George as he passed. Each one, regardless of age or branch of service, stood at attention and saluted. The gesture rippled through the parade like a wave, a silent tribute that spoke volumes. A group of young Marines, who had been marching a few units ahead, broke formation. With precision that spoke of countless hours of drill practice, they moved to form an honor guard around George. Their dress blues were immaculate, white gloves gleaming in the late morning sun. They matched their pace to his without hesitation, their presence both protective and respectful. Sandra noticed how George acknowledged them, a slight nod, a gentle smile, but no protest at their gesture. She remembered what the sailor had said about his humility, how he never sought recognition. Yet here it was, being given freely by those who understood the true weight of his sacrifices. The band transitioned into the battle hymn of the Republic, its powerful notes carrying across the crowd. Someone near Sandra began to sing along softly, and soon others joined in. The melody spread through the spectators, a spontaneous chorus that brought tears to many eyes. "He never misses a parade," a woman nearby explained to her young daughter. "Rain or shine, hot or cold, George is always here, because he made a promise to remember those who didn't come home." The girl nodded solemnly, her small hand pressed against her heart as George passed. Sandra watched as an elderly woman stepped out from the crowd, moving carefully to the edge of the parade route. In her hands, she held a single red rose. As George drew near, she reached out to offer it to him. He paused, another of those pauses that had so irritated Sandra earlier, and took the flower with gentle hands. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Later, Sandra would learn that the woman's husband had been one of the 23 men George had saved. The Marine Honor Guard adjusted smoothly to the brief stop, maintaining their protective formation around George. One of them, noticing that George was tiring slightly, quietly offered his arm for support. George shook his head with a smile, standing straighter. The young Marine nodded in understanding and resumed his position, but stayed close, ready to help if needed. A photographer from the Chicago Tribune moved along the sidewalk, capturing images of the scene. His camera clicked rapidly, documenting the honor guard, the saluting veterans, the crowds paying tribute. But mostly he focused on George, the Medal of Honor recipient who drew respect not for the medal itself, but for the character that had earned it. The reviewing stand was now just ahead, filled with city officials and military dignitaries. As George approached, everyone on the platform rose to their feet. The mayor, who had been chatting with an aide, fell silent. A general in full-dress uniform moved to the front of the stand, his hand already rising to return George's salute. The band's music softened, allowing the parade announcer's voice to carry clearly over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, Medal of Honor recipient George Thompson." The words were simple, but they carried weight. The crowd's applause swelled, drowning out the rest of the announcement. Sandra noticed how different this applause was from the polite clapping that had accompanied other parts of the parade. This was deep, genuine appreciation, the kind that comes from understanding, not obligation. People weren't just clapping because it was expected. They were expressing gratitude that went beyond words. A group of schoolchildren near the reviewing stand began waving hand-drawn signs they'd prepared specially for George. "Our hero." One read, decorated with carefully drawn stars and stripes. "Thank you for your sacrifice," said another, the letters wobbly but sincere. George paused again, and this time Sandra felt no impatience, only understanding, to wave back at them. The Marines around him maintained their formation, their young faces serious but proud. One of them, barely more than 20, blinked rapidly, fighting back tears as George exchanged salutes with the general on the reviewing stand. Later, that Marine would tell his own children about the day he had the honor of escorting a living legend. Through it all, George maintained the same humble dignity that had marked his entire life. He acknowledged the tribute with grace, but without showmanship. His focus seemed to be not on the applause or the honors, but on something distant, perhaps memories of those he'd served with, those who hadn't returned to receive such acclaim. Sandra watched as he touched the Medal of Honor that hung around his neck, not drawing attention to it, but as if reminding himself of its weight, its meaning. She thought about how many times he must have made this journey, year after year, carrying both visible and invisible burdens with quiet strength. The young soldier who had spoken earlier leaned over to Sandra. "You see how he keeps his eyes forward, scanning the crowd? Old habits die hard. Even now, he's watching out for others, making sure everyone's okay. That's just who he is." As George passed the reviewing stand, a flight of military helicopters appeared overhead, perfectly timed to pay tribute. Their rotors thumped a steady beat as they flew in the missing man formation, a space left empty to honor fallen comrades. George looked up, and for a moment his expression changed, perhaps remembering similar helicopters from a different time, a different place. The crowd fell silent, watching the helicopters pass. In that moment of quiet, Sandra could hear George's measured steps, the subtle tap of his cane on the pavement. Each sound seemed to echo with meaning, with history, with sacrifice. She thought about how she had cursed those slow steps earlier and felt shame wash over her again. The Marine Honor Guard prepared to peel away, their duty complete. But before they did, each one shook George's hand. The gesture wasn't part of any official protocol. It was simply respect, passed from one generation of warriors to another. George spoke quietly to each Marine, and though Sandra couldn't hear his words, she could see how they affected the young men, their postures straightening even further with pride. Sandra stood rooted to her spot, the weight of her earlier behavior pressing down on her like a physical force. The phone in her pocket, now turned off, felt like it was burning against her leg. A reminder of how she'd prioritized emails and deadlines over something so much more meaningful. The shame wasn't just about her outburst anymore. It was about everything that outburst represented. Around her, people were still watching George with reverent attention, but Sandra could barely lift her eyes. She noticed how some spectators were pointedly ignoring her now, creating a small bubble of isolation around her position at the barrier. Even Rachel, her friend who had dragged her here this morning, maintained her distance, standing several feet away with her arms crossed. The sailor who had shared George's story had moved back into the crowd, but Sandra could still feel the impact of his words. She thought about the old photograph he'd shown her, the young George, covered in mud and blood, supporting a wounded comrade. The image seemed burned into her memory, creating a stark contrast with her own concerns about missing a few hours of work. A light breeze carried snippets of conversation from nearby spectators. "Can't believe someone would actually... In this day and age, you'd think people would show more? My grandfather would have never." Each fragment felt like another small wound to her conscience. The worst part was knowing she deserved every bit of their disapproval. Sandra's mind wandered back to her morning routine, how she'd complained about having to come to the parade, how she'd grumbled about parking, how she'd stood there scrolling through social media instead of paying attention. She thought about all the moments she'd missed, all the stories she could have heard, all the respect she could have shown if she'd just put her phone away and opened her eyes. The Johnson brief, which had seemed so crucially important an hour ago, now felt trivial. She tried to imagine explaining to her boss why she'd been so worried about it. "Sorry, I was too busy disrespecting a Medal of Honor recipient to finish it," and felt her face burn with renewed embarrassment. What would her colleagues think if they knew? What would her parents say? A young girl nearby was sitting on her father's shoulders, waving a small flag with enthusiasm. Sandra watched as the father explained something to his daughter, pointing toward George and speaking in hushed, respectful tones. The child listened with wide-eyed attention, absorbing a lesson about respect and gratitude that Sandra, for all her education and professional success, had somehow missed. The morning sun had risen higher, but Sandra felt cold despite the warmth. She wrapped her arms around herself, less from the temperature and more from a desire to make herself smaller, less noticeable. Her expensive wool coat, which she'd been so proud of, now felt like costume jewelry at a formal event, flashy but ultimately meaningless. A veteran standing near her wiped tears from his eyes as George passed. The man couldn't have been much older than 40, probably a veteran of more recent conflicts, but his reaction to George spoke of a deep understanding that transcended generations. Sandra realized she'd been standing in a crowd full of stories, full of connections, full of meaning, and she'd been too self-absorbed to notice any of it. Her law firm's motto came back to her: excellence in all things. She'd always thought it applied to legal briefs and client meetings, to billable hours and case precedents. Now she wondered about excellence in character, in respect, in basic human decency. By any of those measures, she had failed spectacularly this morning. The memories of her outburst kept replaying in her mind, each replay revealing new layers of inappropriate behavior. She remembered the tone of her voice, the impatient eye roll, the dismissive wave of her hand. Each gesture now seemed monumentally disrespectful, not just to George but to everyone who had ever served, everyone who had lost someone in service, everyone who understood the true meaning of sacrifice. Sandra thought about her own grandfather, who had passed away when she was young. He'd served in Korea, though he rarely talked about it. Would he have been in a parade like this? Would someone like her younger self have yelled at him to hurry up? The thought made her stomach turn. A photographer nearby was reviewing shots on his camera's display screen. Sandra caught a glimpse of one. George's profile against the morning sun, his medals gleaming, the Marine Honor Guard flanking him with pride. The image captured everything she had failed to see earlier. The dignity, the history, the weight of experience etched into every line of his face. Her legal training had taught her to look for precedents, to learn from past decisions. But what precedent could she cite for this kind of mistake? What case law could guide her through the realization that she had publicly disrespected someone who represented the very best of human courage and sacrifice? The crowd's continuing respectful silence felt like an indictment of her behavior. These people, young and old, military and civilian, understood something fundamental that she had missed. They understood that some things were worth waiting for, some people were worth honoring, some moments were worth preserving even in our rushed and busy world. Sandra watched as a teenage boy removed his baseball cap as George passed, elbowing his friend to do the same. The simple gesture carried more maturity and understanding than she had shown all morning. These kids, probably not even old enough to drive, grasped what she, a successful professional, had failed to comprehend. Her phone stayed off in her pocket, and for the first time that morning, Sandra felt no urge to check it. The emails would wait. The briefs would wait. The meetings would wait. Some things, respect, gratitude, honor, shouldn't have to wait. She had needed this harsh lesson to understand that truth. Rachel finally glanced in her direction, and Sandra saw something shift in her friend's expression. Not forgiveness, exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Sandra wanted to apologize, to explain that she finally got it, that she was ashamed of her behavior, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she explain something she was still struggling to process herself? The sun caught George's medals again, sending brief flashes of light across the crowd. Sandra thought about what those medals represented, not just the physical acts of heroism, but the character behind them. the willingness to put others first, to endure pain and hardship for a greater cause, to maintain dignity and humility even in the face of extraordinary achievement. She had demonstrated none of those qualities today. As the parade continued its slow, dignified progress, Sandra remained in her spot, no longer checking the time, no longer thinking about deadlines or meetings or emails. Instead, she stood in silent witness to her own failure of character, understanding that this Veterans Day would mark not just a commemoration of service and sacrifice, but the beginning of her own belated education in what truly matters. Sandra took a deep breath and turned toward the sailor who had told her George's story. He stood a few feet away now, his attention focused on the parade, but she could see he was still aware of her presence. Each step toward him felt heavy with the weight of her regret. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the parade's ambient noise. When he turned to look at her, she had to resist the urge to look away. The disappointment in his eyes hadn't fully faded, but there was something else there now, a willingness to listen, perhaps. She started, then stopped, realizing that no practiced legal argument could help her here. No carefully worded statement could undo what she'd done. Instead, she opted for simple truth. "Thank you for telling me about George. I needed to hear it." The sailor studied her face for a moment, seeming to weigh the sincerity of her words. Around them, the crowd continued to watch the parade, but Sandra could feel several people listening to their exchange, wondering if she would make things better or worse. "You know," the sailor said finally, "my father used to say that the hardest words to say are 'I was wrong.' But they're also the most important." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "The second hardest thing is to actually learn from being wrong." Sandra nodded, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "I was wrong," she whispered, the words coming out rough with emotion. "I was so wrong, and I don't know how to fix it." The sailor's expression softened slightly. "Maybe that's because some things can't be fixed with words alone," he suggested. "Sometimes the best apology is changing how we act moving forward." A young veteran standing nearby had overheard their conversation. He turned toward them, his prosthetic leg visible beneath his shorts. "You want to make it right?" he asked, not unkindly. "Start by learning. Really learning. About sacrifice, about service, about what it means to put something bigger than yourself first." Sandra listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time that day. She thought about her own life, how she measured success in billable hours and client victories. How different was that from measuring it in lives saved, in sacrifices made, in service given? George leads a veteran support group at the VA hospital every Thursday, the sailor offered quietly. "They're always looking for volunteers to help with paperwork, phone calls, whatever's needed." He left the suggestion hanging in the air, neither a demand nor an accusation, just a possibility. Sandra found herself reaching for her phone again, but this time not to check emails. Instead, she opened her notes app, hands shaking slightly as she typed VA Hospital Thursdays. The simple act felt like a commitment, a small first step toward something better. The crowd around them had thinned slightly as people moved along the parade route, following George's progress. But those who remained nearby seemed to sense something important happening. The bubble of isolation around Sandra had begun to dissolve, replaced by a cautious acceptance of her attempt at redemption. Rachel had edged closer too, close enough now to hear the conversation. Sandra could see her friend's expression beginning to thaw, recognizing genuine remorse in Sandra's demeanor. Still, neither of them spoke directly to each other yet. Some bridges would take longer to rebuild than others. George was too far ahead now for Sandra to offer a direct apology, and perhaps that was fitting. Any words she could have said would have felt inadequate, hollow in the face of his lifetime of service and sacrifice. Instead, she joined the crowd in applauding him, her claps carrying the weight of newfound understanding and respect. The nurse who had treated George years ago was still nearby. She watched Sandra's quiet transformation with knowing eyes. "You know," she said gently, "in all the years I treated George, he never once held a grudge against anyone. Not even the enemies who shot him. He always said life was too short for bitterness." Sandra absorbed these words, finding a small measure of comfort in them. Not forgiveness, exactly, but perhaps the possibility of it. She thought about how George had carried wounded men to safety despite his own injuries, how he had pushed through pain and exhaustion to save others. Surely, she could push through her own discomfort to become better. The young soldier with the phone had stopped recording long ago, seeming to understand that some moments of growth and realization shouldn't be documented for social media. He caught Sandra's eye and gave her a small nod, as if acknowledging that everyone had to learn these lessons sometime, though perhaps not everyone learned them so publicly. "The parade comes through every year," the sailor said, his voice gentler now. "George walks it every time he can, because he made a promise to remember, and he keeps his promises." The unspoken suggestion hung in the air, that Sandra too could make a promise, could choose to remember this day and let it change her. She looked down the parade route, where she could still see the honor guard surrounding George. Even from this distance, his dignity was evident in every step. Sandra thought about how she'd watch next year's parade differently, not as an inconvenience to be endured, but as a privilege to be honored. The applause continued to ripple through the crowd, following George's progress like a wave. Sandra's own clapping felt different now, not the perfunctory gesture it would have been hours ago, but something real, something meaningful. Her hands stung from clapping so hard, but she welcomed the sensation as a small penance. "Sometimes," the nurse said, almost to herself, "the best way to honor someone is to learn from them, to take what they teach us, even unintentionally, and use it to become better." She looked at Sandra with gentle understanding. The parade only lasts a few hours, but what we learn here can last a lifetime. Sandra felt the truth of those words settle into her heart. She looked at her watch, not to count the minutes until she could leave, but to mark this moment in time. This Veterans Day would forever be divided into before and after, before she understood, and after she began to learn. The sailor pulled out his wallet again, this time removing a small business card. "The VA hospital," he said simply, holding it out to her. "Ask for Mike in the volunteer office. Tell him Jack sent you." Sandra took the card carefully, treating it not as a penance, but as an opportunity. As the parade continued its steady progress through the streets of Chicago, Sandra remained where she was, the business card clutched in one hand, her silent applause continuing with the other. She couldn't change what she'd done, but she could change what she would do next. Sometimes she realized that had to be enough. The parade had begun winding down, but Sandra stayed rooted to her spot, processing everything that had happened. The morning sun had shifted to afternoon, casting different shadows on the street where her perspective on life had changed so dramatically. The crowd was thinning now, families gathering their belongings, veterans exchanging final handshakes, children clutching their small flags. She watched as people began to drift away, noticing details she'd missed earlier in her impatience. An elderly couple helping each other walk back to their car, the husband's Vietnam veteran cap sitting proudly on his head. A young mother explaining to her curious toddler why people had been crying during the parade. A group of teenagers actually putting their phones away without being asked, their faces thoughtful and subdued. Rachel finally approached her, breaking the distance that had grown between them since Sandra's outburst. "Ready to go?" she asked, her voice neutral but not unkind. Sandra looked down at the VA hospital card in her hand, then back at her friend. "Not yet," she replied softly. I think I need to stay a bit longer." Rachel nodded, understanding something had fundamentally shifted in her friend. She settled in beside Sandra, their shoulders almost touching, a silent gesture of reconciliation. The image of George kept replaying in Sandra's mind, not just his slow, dignified walk in the parade, but the younger version from the photograph, carrying wounded men to safety. She thought about how he'd moved through life after the war, turning his pain into purpose, his struggles into strength. Her phone remained off in her pocket, and surprisingly, she felt no urge to check it. The urgent emails, the deadlines, the Johnson brief, they all seemed to belong to a different person now, someone she'd been just hours ago but no longer recognized. That Sandra had been so focused on climbing the corporate ladder that she'd forgotten to look around and see what really mattered. A street sweeper was already moving along the parade route, cleaning up the scattered confetti and paper. Sandra watched it methodically erasing the physical evidence of the parade, knowing that while the streets could be cleaned, her memory of this day would remain permanently marked. "You know," Rachel said quietly, breaking their silence, "my grandfather was a veteran too. Never talked about it much, but every Veterans Day, he'd sit us down and make sure we understood." She paused, looking at Sandra. Not just about the war, but about what it means to be part of something bigger than yourself. Sandra felt her throat tighten. "I never really thought about it before," she admitted. "It was just another holiday, another parade, another reason traffic was backed up downtown." She shook her head at her own former ignorance. "How did I get so disconnected?" A passing veteran overheard her words and stopped. "It's easier than you think," he said kindly. "We all get caught up in our own lives, our own problems. The trick is recognizing when we've lost perspective and finding our way back." Sandra looked down at her expensive shoes, now dusty from standing at the parade for hours. She thought about how she'd spent more time that morning worrying about scuffing them than considering the significance of the day. The realization made her cringe inwardly. The afternoon light softened, and Sandra finally turned to leave, but not before taking one last look down the now quiet parade route. The VA hospital card felt warm in her hand, like a promise waiting to be kept. She carefully tucked it into her wallet, placing it where her business cards usually went. "I think I'm going to call in sick tomorrow," she said suddenly, surprising herself as much as Rachel. "Going to go down to the VA hospital instead. See if they can use an extra pair of hands." The words came out naturally, feeling right in a way that fancy legal arguments never had. Rachel smiled, really smiled, for the first time since Sandra's outburst. "Want some company?" she offered. Sandra felt a rush of gratitude for her friend's forgiveness, for her willingness to join in this small step toward redemption. As they walked back to their cars, Sandra noticed other changes in herself. The city sounds that had irritated her that morning, the helicopters, the bands, the crowds, now carried different meanings. Each noise represented people coming together to remember, to honor, to understand. A gust of wind brought the sound of distant taps being played, probably at the ceremony's end. Sandra stopped walking, instinctively standing still until the last note faded. She saw others on the street doing the same and felt connected to them in a way she hadn't before. Not through shared experiences, but through shared respect. "You know what the hardest part of today was?" she asked Rachel as they resumed walking. "Realizing that I've probably walked past dozens of Georges in my life. Never bothering to look up from my phone. Never thinking about their stories. Never showing the respect they deserved." Rachel squeezed her arm gently. "The important thing is that you see it now," she said. "And knowing you, once you see something, you don't ignore it." Sandra thought about the upcoming week. She'd have to explain to her boss why the Johnson brief wasn't finished, why she needed to adjust her schedule to volunteer at the VA. It wouldn't be an easy conversation, but for the first time in her career, she felt certain about prioritizing something above work. As they reached their cars, Sandra caught her reflection in the window. She looked different somehow, or maybe she was just seeing herself differently. The ambitious lawyer was still there, but now there was something else too, an awareness of the deeper currents running beneath the surface of everyday life. She thought about George one last time, imagining him back home now, probably resting after the long parade. She wondered what stories he might share at the next VA meeting, what wisdom he might pass on. And this time, instead of feeling shame about her behavior, she felt something else. Determination. Determination to learn, to understand, to be better. Starting her car, Sandra realized that while the parade had ended, something else was just beginning. She had walked into this Veterans Day thinking about deadlines and emails, about the inconvenience of crowds and the waste of a working morning. She was leaving with a changed heart, a new perspective, and a small card in her wallet that represented the first step toward a different kind of life. The city was returning to its normal rhythm, but Sandra knew she wouldn't. Some lessons once learned couldn't be unlearned. Some changes, once made, couldn't be unmade. And as she drove home through the streets of Chicago, She understood that this Veterans Day would mark not just a date on the calendar, but the day she finally learned to look up, to see others, and to understand what truly mattered.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.